The end never looks like the end. It doesn't arrive with chaos, alarms, or a clear moment where everyone agrees something is broken. It arrives quietly, gradually, almost politely. Life continues to move forward. Routines stay intact, and people adapt just enough to keep going. That's what makes it dangerous. When systems truly begin to fail, the first thing that disappears isn't money, power, or stability. It's clarity. The sense that cause and effect still makes sense. People feel a growing tension, but they can't point to a single reason why. Everything still works, just not as well as it used to. The streets are still full. Jobs still exist. Institutions still operate. But something subtle has changed beneath the surface. Expectations shrink. Futures become shorter. Decisions are made with caution instead of confidence. And almost no one calls it the beginning. History shows this pattern again and again. Major collapses never start with dramatic endings. They start with small adjustments that feel reasonable at the time. A temporary rule here. A minor sacrifice there. Each step explained as necessary. Each decision framed as protection, not loss. What's happening isn't collapse yet. It's normalization. People learn to live with less without fully noticing when it started. They postpone plans instead of canceling them. They lower standards instead of questioning the system. Over time, what once felt unacceptable becomes tolerable. What once felt alarming becomes routine. This is how decline hides. The most dangerous phase of any system isn't when people panic. Panic creates pressure. Panic forces change. The most dangerous phase is when people adapt quietly, when they internalize instability as normal life, when discomfort becomes familiar enough to ignore. Because at that point, the system no longer needs force to survive. It relies on behavior. Language plays a crucial role here. Words soften reality. Loss becomes adjustment. Shortage becomes rebalancing. Control becomes coordination. Nothing sounds extreme. Nothing feels urgent. And because nothing feels urgent, nothing changes. The end never announces itself because it doesn't need to. It advances through incentives, through silence, through exhaustion. People become tired, not physically, but mentally. Tired of reacting. Tired of questioning. Tired of expecting better. And when that fatigue sets in, the system stabilizes in a fragile equilibrium, not healthy enough to grow, not broken enough to confront. This is the stage where societies drift, not toward collapse directly, but toward a narrower version of themselves. Less ambition, less trust, less room for error. The future starts to feel smaller, even if no one says out loud. And the most unsettling part is this. While all this is happening, life still looks normal from the outside. Families still gather. Houses still sell. Markets still open. Headlines still reassure. Nothing feels like an ending. That's why people living inside historical declines almost always misjudge them. They look for a dramatic signal that never comes. They wait for something obvious, something undeniable, something loud enough to force action. But the real shift already happened earlier, when the system stopped serving long-term stability and started prioritizing short-term survival. By the time consequences become visible, the foundation has already been weakened, options narrow, trade-offs become harsher, and choices that once existed quietly disappear. The end doesn't arrive with destruction. It arrives with acceptance. Acceptance that things are just how they are now. Acceptance that expectations were unrealistic. Acceptance that stability is temporary and planning is risky. And once that mindset takes hold, history shows a hard truth. Systems rarely reverse from that point without a shock. Something external. Something disruptive. Something painful enough to break the illusion of normality. Until then, the end remains invisible, hiding in plain sight. After acceptance sets in, something more subtle takes over. Stability stops being a condition and starts becoming a performance. Institutions no longer exist primarily to function well, but to appear functional. The goal quietly shifts from solving problems to managing perception. This is where the system changes its relationship with truth. Numbers still exist, but they are framed carefully. Metrics still matter, but only the ones that support confidence. Anything uncomfortable is delayed, redefined, or pushed into technical language that feels distant from everyday life. Complexity becomes a shield. The more complicated something sounds, the less people challenge it. And slowly, trust moves away from lived experience. People feel pressure in their daily lives, tighter margins, less flexibility, more risk, yet are told that fundamentals remain strong. That contradiction creates a psychological split. Instead of questioning the system, many question themselves. Maybe the problem is personal. Maybe the struggle is individual failure, not structural strain. This internalization is powerful. When stress feels personal, collective action weakens. People isolate. They compete instead of coordinate. They adapt privately instead of demanding change publicly. And from the system's perspective, that's ideal. Pressure is absorbed silently, not reflected upward. At this stage, resilience is praised, but only the kind that endures, not the kind that resists. The system rewards those who comply smoothly, those who absorb volatility without complaint, those who adjust expectations downward while maintaining output. Over time, endurance replaces progress as the primary virtue. Survival becomes success. But endurance has limits. As the gap between appearance and reality grows, maintaining performance requires more energy, more explanation, more reassurance. The narrative becomes heavier, more defensive. Confidence is repeated often, not because it's strong, but because it's fragile. This is when institutions start protecting themselves rather than the people they serve. Rules multiply. Procedures thicken. Accountability diffuses. No single decision feels responsible for the outcome, yet the outcome keeps getting worse. Responsibility dissolves into systems, committees, and frameworks. Everyone follows protocol. No one owns the result. For individuals, this creates a deep sense of unease. Not fear, uncertainty. A feeling that effort no longer guarantees stability. That playing by the rules no longer produces predictable outcomes. That the future is no longer something you build toward, but something you brace for. Psychologically, this changes behavior fast. Long-term thinking fades. Short-term optimization takes over. People become cautious, defensive, reactive. Risk tolerance collapses, not because people are irrational, but because the environment no longer rewards patience. And once that shift happens at scale, the system starts feeding on itself. Reduced trust leads to reduced investment, not just financial, but emotional and social. People disengage. They stop believing improvement is possible. They stop imagining better versions of the future. And when imagination disappears, so does momentum. What makes this stage so difficult to recognize is that nothing visibly collapses. There's no single failure, no dramatic turning point. Everything continues, just slower, heavier, more constrained. The system still stands, but it's hollowing out. From the outside, it looks stable. From the inside, it feels exhausting. And exhaustion is not neutral. It changes priorities. It makes people choose safety over growth, certainty over opportunity, conformity over innovation. The system becomes quieter, less dynamic, less resilient. Even as it insists everything is under control, this is the phase where history shows a dangerous illusion forming. The belief that because collapse hasn't happened yet, it won't. That because the system still functions, it always will. But performance is not strength, and stability that requires constant explanation is already fragile. By the time cracks become undeniable, the capacity to respond has already been drained, not by crisis, but by years of quiet adaptation. Once exhaustion sets in, systems don't collapse from chaos. They drift under the weight of incentives that no longer align with long-term stability. Nothing dramatic changes overnight. The rules stay mostly the same. The structure looks familiar, but the motivations inside it shift, and that's where the damage accelerates. In healthy systems, incentives reward foresight. Delayed gratification matters. Risk is balanced by responsibility. When mistakes happen, they carry consequences. Over time, this creates discipline, trust, and resilience. But in declining systems, incentives invert. Short-term performance starts to matter more than long-term outcomes. Decisions are judged by how they look now, not by what they produce later. Success becomes something reported, not something felt. And because consequences are delayed, responsibility becomes abstract. This changes behavior at every level. Leaders focus on managing appearances rather than fixing foundations. Institutions prioritize continuity over correction. Individuals respond by protecting themselves instead of investing in the future. Each reaction makes sense in isolation. Together, they hollow the system out. One of the most corrosive effects of this shift is moral distancing. When outcomes are separated from decisions by time, complexity, or bureaucracy, people stop feeling directly responsible. Harm becomes indirect. Accountability becomes shared so widely that it disappears. Everyone is following incentives. No one feels like the cause. This creates a strange calm. Bad outcomes no longer feel like failures, just side effects. Losses are explained as unavoidable. Decline is reframed as transition. And because no single action feels wrong enough to resist, the system continues unchanged. Psychologically, this is devastating. People sense that effort no longer connects to results. That playing by the rules doesn't guarantee fairness. That sacrifice isn't rewarded the way it used to be. When that connection breaks, motivation erodes quietly, not through anger, but through detachment. People stop expecting systems to work for them. They adjust expectations downward. They hedge instead of commit. They plan less, trust less, and invest less, not just financially, but emotionally. At scale, this behavior feeds back into the system. Lower trust reduces cooperation. Reduced cooperation increases friction. Increased friction makes outcomes worse, reinforcing the belief that nothing works anymore. It becomes a self-reinforcing loop, driven not by collapse but by resignation. And still, nothing looks broken. From the outside, processes continue. Policies are updated. Reports are published. Meetings are held. Everything appears orderly. But inside, the system is losing the one thing it cannot function without: belief. Belief that the future will be better than the present. Belief that effort leads somewhere meaningful. Belief that stability is something you build, not something you borrow. Once belief erodes, systems become fragile even if they look strong. This is why late-stage systems rely so heavily on narratives. Stories replace results. Confidence is repeated. Reassurance becomes constant. The system needs people to believe because belief is now doing the work that structure used to do. But belief without alignment is brittle. Eventually, even small shocks feel larger than they should. Minor disruptions create outsized reactions, not because the event is severe, but because the system has lost its buffer, psychological, social, and institutional. At that point, decline doesn't need a dramatic cause. It only needs pressure, and pressure always comes. History shows that when incentives remain misaligned long enough, correction becomes painful, not because people didn't see it coming, but because adaptation delayed action. The system survived too long in an unstable state, draining its capacity to respond. By the time adjustment becomes unavoidable, it arrives suddenly, not as an explosion, but as a realization that the old rules no longer work. When systems reach this stage, they rarely fix their weaknesses. Instead, they relocate them. Problems aren't eliminated. They're redistributed, shifted quietly from institutions to individuals, from balance sheets to daily life, from visible failures to invisible strain. This is where decline becomes personal. The system continues to function, but at a price that is no longer paid centrally. Risk is pushed outward. Responsibility is fragmented. Stability becomes conditional. something you earn temporarily rather than something you can rely on. And most people feel it without seeing it clearly. Cost appears friction, as delays, as complexity, as rules that take more time, more energy, more paperwork. None of it feels catastrophic, but together it drains capacity. Life becomes heavier to manage. What used to be automatic now requires effort. This transfer is subtle by design. Direct collapse creates resistance. Indirect pressure creates compliance. When costs are spread thin across millions of people, no single burden feels large enough to confront. Yet the collective weight is enormous. Psychologically, this changes how people relate to the system. Instead of expecting protection, people start expecting exposure. They assume that mistakes will be theirs alone to absorb. That support will be conditional. That safety nets exist more in theory than in practice. Planning becomes defensive. This creates a society that looks functional but feels insecure. Institutions, meanwhile, grow more insulated. Their primary goal becomes continuity. Keeping processes running, avoiding visible failure, maintaining confidence. Solving root problems becomes secondary because root solutions are disruptive. They require admitting weakness. They require sacrifice at the top. So the system chooses stability of appearance over stability of structure. Language once again plays a role. Rising burdens are framed as responsibility. Reduced support is framed as efficiency. Risk exposure is framed as empowerment. Everything sounds reasonable until lived reality contradicts it. At this point, people begin compensating privately. They work longer, save less, delay decisions, rely on informal networks, trade certainty for flexibility. None of these choices are irrational. They're adaptive responses to a system that no longer absorbs shocks. But adaptation has limits. As private buffers thin, resilience decreases. Small disruptions feel larger. Setbacks linger longer. Recovery takes more time. And because everyone is managing their own risk, collective resilience erodes. This is where fragility hides. The system appears calm precisely because stress is dispersed. There are no dramatic failures because pressure is constantly leaking outward. But that leakage weakens the entire structure. And the most dangerous part is this. People mistake endurance for stability. They assume that because they are coping, the system is healthy. Because they are surviving, nothing fundamental is wrong. But survival is not the same as sustainability. History shows that when systems reach this phase, they become highly sensitive to shocks. Not massive shocks, ordinary ones. Events that would once have been absorbed now trigger outsized consequences. Because the buffers are gone, trust is thinner, margins are tighter, flexibility is reduced. The system is still standing, but it's rigid. And rigid systems don't bend, they fracture. What unsettling is that from the inside? This phase still doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like a demanding present, a constant need to manage, to adjust, to stay alert. People tell themselves this is temporary, but temporary states that last long enough become permanent conditions. And once a system normalizes cost transfer as a survival mechanism, reversing becomes extremely difficult, because restoring stability would require pulling risk back in, and that would expose how fragile the structure really is. So the system continues forward, quieter, heavier, more strained, not collapsing, not recovering, just moving closer to a point where even small pressure becomes too much. There's a moment in every long decline when reversal is no longer a matter of policy, leadership, or reform, not because solutions don't exist, but because the system has crossed a psychological threshold. Expectations have adjusted too far. Trust has eroded too deeply. Behavior has already adapted to instability. This is the point where systems stop turning back. By now, people no longer ask whether things will improve. They ask how to protect themselves if they don't. That shift is subtle but decisive. It changes how societies allocate energy, attention, and risk. When enough individuals adopt defensive thinking, the system loses its capacity to regenerate. Innovation slows because uncertainty punishes patience. Long-term projects feel irresponsible. Cooperation weakens because trust is scarce. Institutions struggle to mobilize collective effort because belief is gone. Everything becomes transactional. At this stage, decline doesn't accelerate through collapse. It accelerates through inertia. The system keeps moving in the same direction because changing course feels more dangerous than continuing forward. Any serious correction would require acknowledging how fragile things have become, and that acknowledgement itself feels destabilizing. So leaders manage time instead of outcomes. They delay, defer, extend, and smooth. Each action buys calm today at the cost of tomorrow. And because tomorrow is abstract, today always wins. Psychologically, this creates a strange tension. People sense that something fundamental is wrong, but they've learned not to expect resolution. Hope becomes conditional. Confidence becomes situational. Planning shrinks to shorter horizons. The future feels compressed. History shows that this is a final quiet phase. Not the end itself, but the last period where the system still looks familiar, where institutions still exist, where routines still function, where collapse feels theoretical. But beneath that surface, flexibility is gone. Once adaptability disappears, systems become vulnerable to ordinary stress. Not extraordinary events, normal ones. Economic slowdowns, political friction, social tension, external pressure. What once would have been absorbed now exposes fault lines. And when the breaking point finally arrives, people are often shocked by how sudden it feels. Not because it was unpredictable, but because the system had been absorbing stress invisibly for so long that no one knew how close it was. The end never looks like the end, until it does. And when it does, the transition is fast. Expectations reset violently. Rules change abruptly. Assumptions collapse all at once. The period of quiet adjustment gives way to forced correction. What's important to understand is this. The damage didn't begin at the breaking point. It accumulated slowly, during years when everything still seemed normal. The real collapse happened earlier, when belief faded, incentives inverted, and costs were pushed outward. The visible end is just a moment when the system can no longer hide its own fragility. That's why studying these patterns matters. Not to predict exact outcomes, not to time events, but to recognize where systems truly are, beneath appearances, beneath narratives, beneath reassurance. Because once you see the structure clearly, you stop mistaking endurance for stability. You stop assuming survival means health. You start understanding that systems don't fail loudly at first. They fail quietly through adaptation. And that awareness changes how you think about risk, planning, and the future. If you want to keep exploring how these patterns repeat across history, how systems drift, stabilize, and eventually correct, then stay with the channel. That perspective is what allows you to see the end while it still looks like the middle.